to the cloud. All right, it's all yours, Josh.
All right, well, welcome everybody to the 76th New York State Political Science Association Annual Conference, hosted virtually by the NYSPSA organization itself. My name is Dr. Joshua Medaw. I'm an associate professor of political science and chair of the Department of Social Sciences here at Clayton State University, as well as the 76th co-chair with Dr. Jim Twombly. The hallmark of the conference each year is a plenary session that either discusses, addresses, or studies the impact of timely events or occurrences that relate to the study of political science writ large. So keeping in that tradition, it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce this Democracy Roundtable led by Dr. Monroe Eagles, Professor of Political Science at the State University of New York at Buffalo. Dr. Eagles is the Academic Director of the Canadian Studies Program, Adjunct Professor of Geography, and former Associate Dean for Graduate Studies in the College of Arts and Sciences at UB. Dr. Eagle has served on a number of editorial boards, the Board of Directors for the Canadian Political Science Association, and is known for such works as Politics, An Introduction to Democratic Government, which is in its 3rd edition, and one of my favorites, Politics is Local, National Politics at the Grassroots Level. Thank you, Dr. Eagles, for leading this discussion this evening. Joining Dr. Eagles on the panel are Dr. Jacob Neuheisel, Dr. Peter Richardson, and Dr. Jim Twombly. Dr. Neuheisel is an associate professor of political science at the State University of New York at Buffalo, who specializes in political communication, election administration, religion and politics, political behavior, and political parties. Dr. Peter Richardson is president of the NYSPSA organization and a senior lecturer at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts, where he teaches in the MS in the Global Studies and International Relations and MA in Strategic Intelligence and Analysis program. And Dr. Jim Twombly is Vice President of NYSPSA, the 76th Conference Co-Chair with myself and Professor of Political Science at Elmira College in Elmira, New York. Dr. Twombly is also the author of The Preamble as Policy, a guidebook to governance and civic duty, there you go, and The Progression of the American Presidency, Individuals, Empires, and Change. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Eagles to lead this timely roundtable on the state of democracy of the world. Dr. Eagles, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Josh, for that kind introduction. And it is really a pleasure to be here and thinking about one of the most consequential sets of developments that I've seen in my now reasonably long life as an academic. So I really am grateful to Jim and you, Josh, for reaching out to me and giving me this chance to reflect a bit on some of the developments that are very much apparent in the world today. So it is somewhat serendipitous that as I thought about the topic of democracy, that it took me back to when I came to Buffalo in 1989. I came from Canada, as you probably surmised, and things had been quite tumultuous in the world. I think that's an understatement, probably. The decline of the Soviet Union, the early processes of democratization in the early 90s and in the Eastern Bloc. But by and large, the tumult that we saw there seemed to be moving us in a positive direction. And I recall fondly Bill Clinton's second inaugural address, where he noted that for the first time in history, there were more people living under democracy than any other form. And we had people like Francis Fukuyama talking about the end of history and the last man, sort of the triumphalism of market globalization and market liberalism and liberal democracy. We seem to have come to a point where not everyone in the world was enjoying these wonderful progressive developments, but they're on the way to getting them. So it was a comforting time. And of course, in America, coming to America, America was at the top of the heap. It was a unipolar world now for the first time. Cold War was receding, and America was the shining city on the hill. Not just a democracy internally, but one of the leading forces for democratization in the world. So 30 some years ago, this was quite a different world. So I thought what I'd do today is just sort of try to set up a discussion by doing the macro level developments that are quite troubling to me, and that I think mark some regression from what now appear to be rather halcyon days of the 90s. And I want to do that in two pieces in a way, and the two intersect, so it's kind of an artificial separation. But the two pieces would be the domestic challenges that democracies face, And then the second one is the more systemic level, the international, the global challenges that democracy seems to be confronting. So domestically, we've had 30 years of globalization, tremendous expansion of the world economy, growth in trade, growth in prosperity, but we know that that prosperity has been unevenly distributed. And the top 1% are enormously more wealthy now than they were 30 years ago, and even the top 10% are more wealthy. Poverty rates, on the other hand, have stayed more or less, steady. So we see an unequal distribution of the benefits of some of the globalization, and that creates a sort of a sense of disquiet and increasing frustration on the part of those who haven't experienced the growth and positive developments in the economy that we've been seeing. Add to that, of course, automation and the shift of jobs, both lost to automation and lost to firms relocating to cheaper labor environments and things. We have a sort of a simmering and long-lasting discontent that has fueled in part, and I hope Jake will talk about this, this is closer to his research than mine, but polarization. And with polarization, there's been a tremendous degradation of democratic norms, civility, respect, tolerance, civil discourse, and a whole backlash against some of the features that many of the people who've been left behind feel are associated attributes of globalization and liberal democracy, and that is, immigration and migration patterns and refugee patterns. There's been I'm obviously just touching on things that are obviously apparent to any of us, a backlash against Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement. So there's an anti-woke quality that has been associated with this group who have been largely marginalized economically. And of course, that manifests itself in growing authoritarian populism that we see here in America with Donald Trump. And we'll see it around the world. I'll just touch on some of that in a minute. But all of this has been, of course, enormously exacerbated by COVID and the resentment of mask and vaccine mandates that seem to be, representing an overreach by the state. So we've got a number of factors that are in confluence that are so degrading the kind of quality of discourse and giving us a common ground to express our differences in ways that are amenable to reconciliation and compromise. And all of that, of course, is packaged in a kind of an anti-elitist message that fuels a great deal of discontent. And of course, we saw what happened on January 6th. It's, there's violence latent and can be, not so latent in these factors. And it's not just us. If it was just us, that would be a problem. But and I think it's especially a problem because we are the sort of the traditional leading democratic power that people turn to. But if you look at the world, both in Europe and in the developing world, you see the emergence of these strong right-wing political movements. The Alternative for Germany in Germany, Viktor Orban's concept of illiberal democracy just got reelected to a fourth consecutive term in Hungary, and makes him the third longest serving leader in Europe after Putin and Lukashenko. Kind of not a great sort of trio. But Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, you look around these, there are extraordinary populist backlashes against globalization, against liberal democracy. So in many countries of the world, the domestic politics, Brexit, of course, I haven't even mentioned Brexit and Boris Johnson in Europe, but the domestic politics has put a great stress on democratic civility and processes, and even the rule of law, if you want to take it to its extreme. And as a Canadian, I see that even in Canada. So peaceable kingdom, as it's supposed to be known. We've got the truckers convoy, which attracted attention even in America. This is one of the times when Canada became newsworthy, and for all the wrong reasons. And of the $9 million or so that came in to support the truckers convoy, about 40% of it came from the US. So, there is a sense that, and I'll come to the international dimension shortly, but these forces of authoritarian populism are aware of one another in this international environment. And of course, they feed on that. So maybe it's time to turn to the international, but I don't want to take up too much time. I'm eager to see this discussion unfold. But at the system level, of course, we have some bad actors who are themselves autocrats and who have an interest in destabilizing the West and all of the things that the West means. And of course, the demon of the day is Vladimir Putin, of course. And Russia has long had an interest in trying to destabilize, delegitimize government in the West. The misinformation or disinformation campaigns in the American election in 2016, probably in 2020, certainly the Brexit referendum in 2016. The Russian hand was in there, meddling, and the goal has been to destabilize. And I think that was in part behind the Putin decision to move into Ukraine, try to drive a wedge in NATO, and he's been empowered by Donald Trump's distrust of NATO, and so we see this history of involvement from autocratic forces in the liberal democratic world, motivated to try to discredit and delegitimize the Western model of government and to make their own system of government look more palatable. And so we have that destabilization aspect of international engagement in the international system. And of course, social media gives all kinds of opportunities for that kind of mischief to be played out. There's a larger picture though, and that has to do with the emergence of China as a global authoritarian force. And that's the part, I guess, that really is most troubling to me, I think, in the end. Ever since at least 2017, the Chinese Communist Party has been aggressively promoting an alternative model of development to what they see as the liberal democratic West. And they've been promoting this anywhere they can, but through the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a very ambitious program to try to expand their influence across Asia into Europe, and gone geographically south to South Asia and even Africa. They've been involved in all kinds of development projects, trying to engage the world, at the same time promoting an alternative view of development where, which I guess you could, for shorthand, call authoritarian capitalism. It's free market forces and with some heavy state involvement in particular sectors, but none of the civil liberties that we associate with liberal democracy and capitalism. So their ambitions here are quite extraordinary, and they're very bitter that as the second largest economic force in the world, they're second rate in the institutions of global governance. So they've been trying their best to set up an alternative system of an international system, financial system, infrastructure, development system, trade system that would enable them to play the kind of global role they think they deserve, they merit. And it constitutes, it's not an ideological attack, but it's certainly an alternative vision to liberal democratic capitalist prosperity. And it's not one that I think most of us would find very palatable. So as I think back over 30 years, I see these two sort of trends, this kind of erosion of democratic principles and norms and institutions internally, even in America, which is I think quite troubling, but elsewhere in the world as well. And at the same time, the international environment kind of moving from a bipolar world where, of the Cold War, where you had competing ideological camps, into a kind of a potentially quite unsettling competition between autocracy and democracy. So here we are, 30 years since I've been here. I've watched this happen kind of gradually, and it seems to be gathering speed. And I think we have to acknowledge that there is a real competition going on. And autocracies have some significant advantages when it comes to holding up. We saw that with China's response to COVID. They saw this as an opportunity for them to, their heavy-handed response to COVID was meant to demonstrate that their system could respond more effectively to a public health challenge. Most of us, I don't think, would swap our liberties for that, but this is how it was couched, I think, in their response, and I think it's deeply troubling. So all of these factors, I think, coupled with or enable and empower another set of actors, I might just mention in conclusion, and that is the folks who would like to see government shrink or minimize its impact on our lives. So, and some of those folks are fairly wealthy. And in the Canadian truckers convoy, I was struck by the fact that the husband of one of the organizers, she was pleading destitution, and they had no money, but he was able to fly from Alberta out to Ottawa on a private jet. So this is not their jet. Somebody's interested in having those, those people reunited and fanning the flames of this protest. So there are some nefarious actors, I think, even within our own political systems that can opportunistically take advantage of these things to destabilize and to discredit government in general. So I hate to be so, I wouldn't say pessimistic, because I don't know what the future is going to bring, but it's not a very hopeful message. And that's what you get, Jim, when you have me think about things that have happened in recent years. It's got me wringing my hands. So I've said enough for, hopefully there's stuff there that we can pick up in some of the discussions. So thank you very much, fellow panelists, for indulging me with that.
Excellent.
Thank you very much, Monroe.
Go ahead. Whoever would like to take over, feel free. Jump right on. Like open conversation. Some great points were made. Great observations.
Well, I was waiting to see if maybe Jacob wanted to take the lead. Go ahead, Jake.
Happy to do that. So I'm an Americanist, so I'm not sure I can speak to the health of democracy abroad. As a comparativist might say, I'm a comparativist with a single case. So I'm quite limited in my worldview here, but in looking at the American democracy, I've seen some positive elements and some negative elements in recent times, and I'm not sure that they're not unrelated, if that makes sense. So on the positive side of the ledger, we've seen a number of elections, national elections, that have seen really, for America anyways, tremendous degrees of political participation. So we have an electorate that is more engaged than it has been in quite some time. It's more participatory than it's been in quite some time. And following some of the research on voter mobilization, that's not just people who are going out and voting and checking boxes. If you mobilize people for politics, the research is increasingly showing that they actually become informed along the way. So to the extent that mobilization is picking up more voters, we're also picking up more informed voters, or voters are becoming more informed because of those mobilization efforts. So that's a positive aspect that I've seen, and perhaps the only one that I'll talk about today, which is to say that if you're coming from a perspective that's very sort of participatory centric, sort of the whole old sort of Carol Pateman focus on democracy as participatory, that's a positive development. Perhaps a middling development would be, even though we've seen a number of attempts to restrict the franchise really across the United States, as someone who studies election administration, they're not terribly successful in actually decreasing turnout. And so there are a number of things that the parties, the candidates can do to overcome a lot of these institutional hurdles that other actors are trying to throw in the way. Again, predominantly Republican from a lot of those places in the Deep South. So I guess that's somewhat positive, except for the fact that they're trying to put those barriers up to begin with, which is very much a negative development. And so that's been continuing in the last couple election cycles, where we see more people engaged in politics and in sort of more diverse political acts as well, engaging in political consumerism, engaging in different patterns of donation enabled by the internet. And so there's more participation that we've seen in the American democracy. But that might also be related to some of the negatives that I'm going to talk about, which is polarization and the erosion of democratic norms. So it turns out that if people are angry, they're probably more motivated to go out and engage in politics. So I'm not sure that the root cause, or some of the root cause of that greater participation, is actually all that much of a positive. And where this starts to intersect with my own work, in some of my recent pieces, I've been looking at things like political tolerance. I've been looking at, in particular, this concept that I'm talking about of reciprocity, the extent to which you both expect the other side to adhere to your right to the public sphere, and uphold your ability to protest, be involved, those kinds of things. And some other work I've done on sort of the parties in our heads, the degree to which we envision the other side as consisting of different kinds of groups and consisting of different kinds of ideologies. And on both of those scores, my work in particular, and the work of others around me, has not been terribly positive in terms of what it means for democratic norms. People don't expect a great degree of reciprocity from others in the public sphere. They don't think that they're going to respect their rights to protest, to be engaged in politics. And it absolutely affects the degree to which they're willing to be tolerant of others. And this expectation may not actually be rooted in reality, as we've seen with some other work out there on misperceptions. The idea that we have these standout groups in our minds, that we think the other side is much more extreme than it actually is much more willing to engage in norms violations than it actually is. And we start to see this becoming something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. People are expressing support for the erosion of democratic norms, expressing support for things that are anti-democratic, that frankly are quite shocking, on the basis of the idea that the other side is likely to do it first. And so a lot of the work I've done in religion and politics has looked at the attitudes of evangelicals. As Trump put it so eloquently, if the Democrats get in power, they're going to hurt God, or something along those lines. And evangelicals may not have internalized that exact message, but there's expectation among some evangelicals we've been surveying that if a more liberal government comes to power, they're going to see things like tax exempt statuses go away for churches and those kinds of things. And there also is this push coming from that to engage in kind of preemptive strikes on democratic norms. And so we're seeing this erosion of democratic norms, erosion of tolerance, that's rooted in perhaps misperceptions of what the other side is and what it's likely to do. And to me, in terms of intersecting my own work, that's been one of the more depressing and disappointing things I've seen coming from my research, is that we don't have a very good sense of what the other side looks like. We don't have a very good sense of what norms they adhere to, but we put the absolute worst things our minds can come up with as a placeholder, and then we act accordingly because of that. And so a lot of this norms erosion might be, at least insofar as my work is somewhere near the mark, self-fulfilling prophecy. We think it's going to happen, therefore we are okay with it if our side is doing it. And that's been an incredibly disappointing thing to see in the last couple studies I've run, is that type of behavior on display. And I'm not sure if this is something that's existed for a long time. We don't have these measures going way back, but it's certainly a concerning thing to see in these contemporary studies we're running.
So very true. So, in your opinion, just with Trump's kind of just rhetoric, can you just speak to that on how it really has attacked those democratic norms? So because he was a huge factor in this recently, the American bias.
Yeah, I think the evidence is a little bit mixed, mostly because it's really hard to measure, what's the effect of Trump's statement X on norm erosion Y. It's really difficult to see that in isolation. There have been attempts, of course, but they've all been a little bit ham-handed, where you look at the location of Trump rallies, and then you look to see acts of political violence and the surrounding area, and the correlation always ends up being less robust than you perhaps would like. So speaking authoritatively is a little difficult here, but I do think that we look to elites for a lot of what we do. We look to cues for any number of things. And if elites are normalizing certain types of rhetoric, certain types of behavior, not only that, but they're being rewarded for it. I think that leads to average individuals adopting similar types of stances. So again, I don't have any evidence to that point, but given the degree to which we use cues to navigate the political world, the injection of those cues is doing something, I have to think, and it certainly isn't a positive development.
Absolutely. And that kind of the idea of Q is jumps right into Jim and a lot of your work and discussions on the presidency and actions of the presidency. So Jim, do you want to pop in here and take it?
Sure.
Yeah.
Then I guess we can bring it full circle with Pete bringing us back to a more comparative and international perspective. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the recent work I've been doing is looking at the effects of polarization on things like the behavior in the Senate, especially with regard to dissenting votes against presidential cabinet nominees. And as Jake was talking, I couldn't help but think of Alan Abramowitz's work and the concept of negative partisanship, that it's not so much I'm a partisan because I love my party, I'm a partisan because I hate the other party. And I really don't know what my party stands for, except I know it's good versus the evil that I hate. And my concern too is, and by the way, I should make a note, considering that Jake is there at the University of Buffalo and he's talking about polarization. Why aren't you wearing one of Jim Campbell's ties?
He didn't give me the tie. He showed it to me, but he didn't give it to me. I think I have the button he made for this book somewhere, but
I
could
saw
throw
him at
that
a
on.
conference a while back before we all went virtual, and he had those ties, and I thought he should be giving those ties out as freebies to promote the book, rather than just wearing it to promote the book. But at any rate, I think it was Campbell, among the many other pieces I've looked at, that talked about how polarization is actually the norm in American politics. We talk about it as this evil that has taken place over, using Monroe's reference frame, of the last 30 years or so. It goes deeper than that. And the period of time from post-World War II to the mid-1990s is really the anomaly, when we were all like getting along and having a great time. And the Anthony Downs notion of the median voter theory in both parties looking for that middle road was different from what the normal was. And we were really a polarized society. Maybe we were just more polite about it, or maybe it was just that we didn't have the technology to spread our venom as quickly and widely as we do now. But I am concerned too. I mean, I see Lisa's here listening in as well. And, a lot of the work that we did in directing the whirlwind, the Trump presidency and the deconstruction of the administrative state, we were looking at how here was one president who could use the traditional tools of bureaucratic management, the appointments process, executive orders, deciding whether or not to challenge decisions in court, that this fed into the undermining of democratic values. And we looked at that notion of public administration as one of our bulwarks of democracy. Here's an anti-democratic institution that really is defending the foundations of what we have as a nation. And that doing so, gutting those agencies, made it very difficult for the federal government to respond to COVID, to respond to the issues raised by Black Lives Matter, to respond to a whole host of social and technological issues that arose. And it was this undermining of democracy that made it impossible for the government to respond in the way it did. And I picked up too on Monroe's comparison, or the introduction of the Chinese response as an example. And I thought immediately of the counterexample of South Korea, as almost as draconian in its application of anti-COVID measures as China. But we think of South Korea as a democracy. We think of China as authoritarian. And in the very beginning, China couldn't get its act together. It took a while. And now they seem to be following, to a certain extent, the South Korean model, but they've got a little bit more muscle behind it than the South Koreans did. So, yeah, I mean, sometimes we think of an authoritarian regime might be more efficient at solving some of our problems, but at what cost? What rights do we want to give up? Maybe we're willing to do that in the middle of a pandemic, unless, of course, you have to wear a mask on a plane or get a vaccination to attend a sporting event or whatever. We're willing to give it up a little bit, but how much and for how long? I think I got the sense from Monroe that he's become a little bit more cynical about democracy over the last couple of decades. And I have known Monroe for that 30-year period he's talking about. And you do tend to get a little bit cynical. Maybe it's just a profession, or maybe it's age, or maybe it's the two combined, making it very difficult to see a way forward. But have to hold out hope that that Jake is right, that participation, mobilization will win the day, and that Stacey Abrams, we were talking about this at the virtual registration desk earlier too, Stacey Abrams will be able to bring the votes out, even with the draconian measures of the Georgia state legislature to suppress the vote. We'll have to see. So I guess there's that little glimmer of hope that I still have, that we can overcome these limitations. And I'm reminded of a line in the movie The Contender, where it's the first woman who's nominated to fill the vacancy of the vice presidency. And she's asked about her religious beliefs. And she says, "This is my church. Congress is the cathedral of democracy." And one hopes that that the character was correct, and that somewhere down the road, somebody's going to fix the archways and the stained glass windows, and that cathedral is going to shine again. I know I sometimes go too far in using metaphors, but I'll leave it there and let Pete give us the world view.
Thank you, Jim. The worldview with a large lean towards the Russian view. Monroe, I want to thank you for introducing and discussing the ideas of domestic level and the international level of democracy and challenge to democracy. And I think Russia's a pretty strong case for that. One of my graduate professors, Central and Eastern European class, Politics of Revolution and Change, we were looking at foreign policy. He was really trying to drive home the fact that how foreign policy is, heavily influenced by domestic policy, and so sort of looking at, foreign policy as domestic policy beyond the water's edge. And I think it's certainly the case looking at Russia's behavior internationally under Putin, exporting or maybe that's a little aggressive, but certainly endorsing and supporting authoritarian governments and movements around the world. I think you had mentioned the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and talking about Central and Eastern Europe, where countries were democratizing. I don't know if a lot of Russians agree with me on this, but I would make the argument that Russia really never did democratize. I mean, I think under Yeltsin it was a semi-democracy at best. I mean, there was, he was so engaged in decentralization for the Russian Federation, and largely to disarm political competitors. So decentralization, democratization under Yeltsin, was largely, not largely, but partially, I guess I would say, designed to keep him in power, keep himself out of jail. If you look at the 1993 Constitution, which is called the super presidential Constitution, this was designed after Yeltsin had tanks firing into Parliament. And so, and he gets reelected, and then he's, ruling more and more by just presidential decree, right? And so the democratic process gets, very undermined, didn't really have a chance to kind of get off its feet. And then in 1998, you have this individual who was in the presidential administration who becomes the presidential representative to the 89 regions of Russia. And this individual is Vladimir Putin. And this was a formative experience for him in seeing just how problematic decentralization and democratization were in Russia. And so, he becomes prime minister, and then he becomes president. If you read Putin's bibliography or autobiography, he talks about this fear of the Yugoslavization of Russia, right? You have Balkan conflicts going on at this time. And he endeavors to and successfully reinstate what's called vertical, right? And so, he brings the regional governments to heel. Nozdritenko, who's in the Russian Far East, who was really problematic, all in 2001, he gets promoted to a position in Moscow, right? You have the culling of political parties. The Federation Council, which is kind of the equivalent of the Senate, is really kind of defanged. You have appointment of regional governors, overlapping of federal districts, super federal districts, and military districts as well. Constitutional amendments, which give now give Putin the ability to run 6-year term limits, so on and so forth. And so, he's incredibly concerned about, maintaining, perpetuating power. And, so this connects into then the international component of this, which, if you look at Russia strategically and you look at it geographically as well, there's kind of this cordon sanitaire, with the exception of Finland and the Baltic states, there's really this cordon sanitaire of autocratic or semi-democratic countries, which are essentially buffer states, in which Putin is terrified to have democracy or any kind of political liberalization thrive because of fear of contagion, right? Well, fear of contagion, politically for his own regime, but also the economic component, fear of economic distancing. And this is, why Putin one of the reasons why Putin had grievances against Ukraine, right? Kind of didn't want to be part of the Eurasian Economic Union, wanted to be with the EU instead. And so looking at all these, different areas, you've got the Caucasus, you've got Central Asia, you've got Mongolia, you've got the Korean Peninsula. That entire arc, are essentially authoritarian, autocratic countries where Russia, Putin is highly committed to keeping these governments in power, which at best they would be pro-Russian, at least they're anti-US or anti-West, right? You can look at the way Putin and Russia deal with the Korean Peninsula, looking at saying, not necessarily endorsing and being there behind Kim Jong-un whenever he does something and clapping their hands, but instead saying, we need to have balance on the Korean Peninsula, right? Which is to say, we don't want the North Korean regime to collapse and then have, another ally, U.S. ally with military, right at the border. And I'll just close up finish off by mentioning that in large part, Putin is supporting authoritarian regimes, not only in contiguous countries and regions, but are also a little bit further afield, because this kind of gets at the idea of democratic peace theory a little bit, but the idea that democratic countries are perhaps more inclined to be friendly with the U.S. and the stronger Western democracies, which necessarily and ideologically serve to undermine authoritarianism. And it's Putin's great fear that countries along the border are going to democratize. and that it's going to spread. So there's this real kind of sort of connection between domestic and foreign policy for Putin, and why Russia is getting is going so much further afield, using the FSB and the SVR to help in that connection, to the extent that it winds up on our own shores, 2016, 2020. So thank you.
Thank you, Pete. Yeah, quite sobering conversation and what's going on. But as Jim was saying, where hopefully there is that cathedral can shine again. So as we have a few minutes left, I just would like to ask the panelists then, can you speculate on where you see things going, both domestically, internationally, maybe in Canada? I mean, as we sit here, I'm in Georgia currently, and Jim mentioned Stacey Abrams, so there's a great groundswell here of Democratic support, but there's also quite a challenge as well. So I'd just like the panelists to kind of give a few minute takeaway where you see things going. Is this more of the same, as Campbell has argued, that we're just in this pattern of polarization, or does this just feel different? So we can start with you, Dr. Eagles, and we'll go from there.
Okay, Josh. Yeah. I hope I wasn't too, I didn't want to come off too pessimistic, Jim. You know me, I'm a kind of a glasses half full type person. But yeah, there are some, I have to confess that the events of the last couple of years in particular have gotten on top of me a bit. But I think the most helpful thing that I've heard here, looking forward, is something that Jake mentioned, and that is that participating citizens are more informed citizens. And so I think maybe longer term, but I've been struck with in some of the participatory acts that I've seen north of the border, for example, the truckers convoy that I'd mentioned, was that these were not informed people. They were acting, in the language of liberty, freedom from COVID restrictions, freedom from government overreach. But I think they've had a lesson in civics in the sense that in their appeals, that they were trying, that the hatred of Justin Trudeau in that group was visceral. And that you see in many of these various countries. We've got a big election coming up on Sunday in France. And the hatred that I've seen play out north of the border, I see again reflected in the absolute, vilification of Emmanuel Macron by the right. So I hope that and these are new participants in many cases. The truckers who got so involved and were willing to lay a lot on the line, I think were acting in good faith, but they were acting in ways that were not well informed. They had petitioned in their defense of freedom. They had petitioned the Governor General, who's the Queen's representative in Canada, and the unelected Senate to act together to remove the duly elected Prime Minister. Justin Trudeau had just been elected in September 2021. So you have some paradoxes here that speak to the need for information and civic education in order to constructively harness these forces that are real. And so I guess that's a hopeful thing for me. I think the truckers have learned a lesson, and Canadian democracy, I think, will be stronger for that. We'll see what happens on Sunday as Marine Le Pen takes on Emmanuel Macron. I think the stakes are extremely high because France has always epitomized the technocratic state that is in the crosshairs of many of these authoritarian populists. So what happens Sunday, I think, is going to be consequential for Europe, of course, and consequential for the world in the sense that it represents a fairly direct confrontation of a technocrat, one of the most elite trained presidents that France has had, versus the populist Marine Le Pen. So anyway, I'm hopeful in that sense that in the longer term, I'm also hopeful in the longer. I bet on democracy every time over autocracy in the long run. Because I just think it brings in a lot of creativity, and it harnesses the capabilities of a population much better than a single person rule. I think the inefficiencies we've seen all along, and the corruption that creeps in, and authoritarianism. So long term, I'm bullish on democracy, but I have to confess I've been battered in the last 30 years has not been a good run. But that's my take on it, Josh, is I don't have a crystal ball, but long term, I think this will all get worked out. And, in terms of the conversation today, I'm sort of encouraged by Jake's observation that in the course of participation, and this was Carol Pateman's argument, after all, people improve themselves in the course of being democratic citizens. And that's always good. So let me try to be a little more balanced and introduce a bit of optimism in life.
No, it's okay. Honesty can sometimes be real. And we'll fingers crossed on Sunday.
Yeah.
Yes. All right, Jake, how about you?
Yeah, I should say that there are a few other potential bright spots as well, and some of the research on norms erosion. And as far as I know, this has not been published. It was just a working paper I saw floating around. There was an effort in these experiments to try to correct misperceptions surrounding the support for norms erosion on the other side. And at least in the near term, right, immediately after being given a corrective, people actually did change or at least their own stated behavior or what they would do in certain situations. So maybe we can be informed out of this in some ways. My tapping the brakes on that, though, is I'm not entirely sure how people get that information in a sea of misinformation and disinformation. So I'm not entirely sure how that message is reinforced broadly in nature and not in the context of an experiment. But I would also say one of the most common questions my students have had lately is how do we get out of this? How do we get out of polarization? And the only thing I can really think of, and I'm sure smarter persons than myself have better answers to this, is trying to think about other times in history where a type of political system, at least in the United States, gave way in some measure, right? There was actually a successful reform movement. And I have to think about the political machines, how they were so corrupt and so over the top that what actually happened, in addition to progressive reform movements starting and trying to undercut their different measures institutionally, another thing that happened at the same time was the people who were actually benefiting from the system, people who got kickbacks or people who, knew where the contracts were going and therefore could benefit from them, collectively agreed that it was too much. It had gone too far, and they applied political pressure in the places that it needed to go in order to issue some kind of correctives. Now, the machines didn't die quickly or quietly, but the origins of change were as much behavioral as they were institutional. And so that's been my stock answer. And I hope I'm right about that. And I hope that kind of profile and courage, can happen and does emerge.
I like that. I mean, we talk about Tammany Hall as something that existed. So as long as we can talk about the past, I hope to repeat that. So I like it. Jim, how about you?
Well, a couple of things come to mind. One, the bright spot for me is I've gotten involved recently in the last couple of years with an organization here in the southern tier of New York. It's called Civics for Action. And our goal is to try to impart some of the knowledge that Jake's talking about to try to break through. We've been hampered the last 2 years with COVID restrictions, but we sponsored a program just before COVID struck with, we call it Future Leaders. We took a bunch of middle school kids and for several days taught them skills in organizing, having civil conversations with people who disagreed with them. We use climate change as the vehicle by which we taught them that. And we're doing that now. We're doing community conversations. We're partnering with Humanities New York to hold online sessions. We're hoping to go back to in person. And in being involved with that, we found there are a myriad of these groups all over the place. People who have seen the same problem, that people just don't understand how government works. The people who are susceptible to the notion, like Monroe was talking about, trying to replace the newly reelected Prime Minister of Canada. Well, here in the United States, we've got idiots in the United States Senate who think they can nullify the 2020 election and reinstall Donald Trump. They just don't understand how the system works. And Civics for Action and other organizations are springing up all over the place to try to counter that. And I guess I'll end with the famous quote that I think Monroe uses in his textbook the one from Winston Churchill, and I'm probably going to get it a little bit wrong, but I'll get it as close as possible. Democracy is the worst form of government, except for those that have been tried from time to time.
Here, here. So, all right. Hey, Pete, have fun matching that one.
Well,
I raise you a Winston Churchill.
be careful. Be careful. I've got something on deck here. Yeah, the idea of being kind of upbeat and optimistic, being a little. I'm just going to read a headline here from the Onion newspaper that kind of sort of show where I'm going to go in my final comments. And it says, Putin pleased as plot to ruin Russian economy, destroy international standing goes exactly to plan. And so, he kind of speaks for itself. Yeah, Putin, I think his position now probably, even though he's fairly secure in it, is probably he's probably in one of the riskiest positions I think he's been since he's been president. I mean, the Russian military is just failing catastrophically in most of Ukraine, and it looks bad for Russia. It looks really bad for Putin. Regardless of Putin, if Putin doesn't stay in power, I think that bodes well for democratization, perhaps democratic resurgence in Central and Eastern Europe, and places like Hungary. If he does stay in power, I think that you'll see individuals perhaps like Viktor Orban, looking and kind of seeing what the risk is. Not that Russia would go that far into Europe, but kind of cozying up to people like Putin and the risk of running afoul of individuals like Putin. So while what's going on in Ukraine is terrible, unconscionable, etc., I think that there is an opportunity for Western European countries, and even the EU, to try to capitalize on this as Central and Eastern European countries, especially former Warsaw Pact members, that kind of flirt with populism, might not be as inclined to do so. That's what I'll close on, a little bit upbeat, hopefully.
Well, on that note, and a little upbeat note, thank you, every single one. This has been a really fascinating conversation, great discussion about where we are. And this is what we do as academics, right? We get together and we talk and we think and we try to work through it. And on a personal note, this has just been a wonderful time to see some old colleagues from UB and have this great conversation. It feels like we're getting a little bit back to normal. So on that note, everyone, thank you so very much. Panelists, thank you. Dr. Eagles, it's always a pleasure. Thank you. And on that note, we'll end here. We'll conclude the plenary session. So thank you all. You have a wonderful evening.
Decision section heads. We'll see you in a few minutes in the executive board meeting. Thank you, Monroe.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank you. It's been great seeing
Enjoyed
you.
it.
Jacob, love the beard.
Nice meeting you, Jake.
I can say Monroe, I
Likewise,
like
good to
your
meet
gray
you.
hair.
Yeah, I saw that, and I immediately knew I was coming in second on the beard front. So.
That's all right. Yeah.
Jacob, do you had, I think you had my mentee at UB too. Do you remember Elizabeth Tillman?
Oh yes.
Yeah, Liz was my mentee. That's how old I'm getting. I was her professor at UPenn Bradford as an undergrad, and I was her way in, and Jim was my way to UB. So
Awesome. Liz is great. She's one of our success stories out there on the tenure track, and
yeah, no,
doing
Liz is
great.
Yeah, so she's another one that we've ruined.
Good work, Josh. We appreciate it.
Thank you. She's wonderful. So
Good to see you,
Okay, guys.
Monroe. Good to meet you,
Bye,
you as well. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye
Bye,
now.
everyone. Thanks again.